This is News Guardians. With Greg Aldridge and Chip Tarbutton on WFJX Fox Radio 910.
Good morning and welcome to News Guardians on Fox Radio 910. I'm Greg, and yes, again, this week we have special guests every day. We have Melissa from the Roanoke Libertarian Party. Pull the microphone right up close to you and talk right in it like this.
Like this? Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Happy Libertarian Wednesday.
Libertarian Wednesday. Melissa got to experience the early morning traffic on 220. And they've got an extra light there on 220 for you.
The whole deal there from Clearbrook to Tanglewood is just stopped traffic.
Mm-hmm. It does that for about an hour and a half.
Yeah, that's lovely.
And then again in the afternoon, it's the same thing going the other way. So I've learned shortcutting through Hunting Hills is attractive and gets you over to Starkey.
I just don't leave around that time, around 5. It's just not even worth it to leave work to just sit in traffic.
Someday there'll be a bypass. And actually, that was a bypass. There used to be an old little road there. The old road's gone. And
well, there was the whole thing about putting an interstate through there, which...
Oh, that'd have been fun.
But now I guess that's going to be closer, the other way, closer to the lake.
If they do it.
Yeah.
Well, good morning. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. We've got a number of stories to talk about today. Let's slide through these and see what we've got. Have you ever heard of car tipping?
Car tipping?
Car tipping. I'll have to show you the picture. You're going to love this. You've heard of cow tipping,
yes.
Right? Now, I've never seen cow tipping.
Putting the little bitty cars up.
Yes!
I saw pictures.
I've been Southern.
I mean, no, shouldn't mess with their property, but it's funny.
I've been a Southerner all my life. Mm-hmm. I have never seen cow tipping firsthand. So to me, it's an urban legend. However, I have seen the pictures of car tipping. So it's obviously it's happening. And yes, it's extremely funny, but it's not a proper way to treat other people's personal property.
Right. That's right.
If you don't believe me, go to newsguardians.com. We've got the picture posted there, and you can see I'm deadly serious. Car tipping, no doubt. Also, a Richmond parent was told by the feds that she can no longer pack lunch for her children. In fact, in this situation, no children are going to be allowed to bring a packed lunch from home unless they get a doctor's excuse, according to the federal regulators of the school program. We're going to talk about that. Snipers are training their scopes on a rancher out in Nevada and have decided to steal his land. They arrested his son. They took the cattle. And why? To save a turtle. I am not kidding. You cannot make this stuff up. And we've got a video posted on newsguardians.com of Morgan Griffith, 9th District Congressman Morgan Griffith, talking about the EPA. It's EPA Wednesday, too, as well, because it looks like we've got 2 EPA stories today. Redrawing state borders using none other than the Clean Air Act. Now, who'd have thought that the Clean Air Act would have allowed the EPA to redraw the borders? That's hysterical. And you've got an article you wanted to talk about.
Right, so we meet this evening, and we've started having discussion group meetings, and we have an article for discussion this evening at our meeting.
Now today, let's see, the article, I've got this up here. It is...
Oh my gosh, you didn't read my article.
Yes, I did. In fact, I won't even look at it.
All these articles.
No, I won't even look at it. And I'll tell you what it is. It talks about how there are 2 schools of thought in the or this person thinks there's 2 schools of thought in the libertarian part. One is humanism, and the other is brutalism. And I did briefly read what they're talking about with these 2 things. Absolutely. And that's interesting. We're going to talk about that a little bit today on the show, and if you're interested in further discussing it, where will you all be meeting tonight and when?
We meet at Corned Beef and Company, which is on Jefferson in downtown Roanoke at 7 o'clock.
Corned Beef and Company. So that's tonight. Wow. There's just and there was another article we talked about yesterday that we
talked about the protesting yesterday.
Yes, and if we have time, because there's so much to talk about, we will also talk about whether or not protests achieve anything. And we had a very interesting discussion on the phone until I realized we should have been doing it on the radio. So stay tuned. We'll be back with Melissa for Libertarian Wednesday and all of these stories when we return to News Guardians on Fox Radio 910.
News Guardians on Fox Radio 910.
And we are back. And good morning again, Melissa.
Good morning.
Now, she says she's not a morning person, but I don't believe her because she is bright and cheery and ready
it's
to...
the energy drink.
and ready to delve deeply into the issues. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about this morning, and this starts off the EPA segment. The EPA is now stealing this rancher out in Nevada, his land, his cattle. They've arrested his son, and seriously, they have snipers on the hills with this man in the crosshairs. I'm not kidding you. And all of this, and I'm opening up the story now so we can take a look at it. All of this is to save a turtle. To save a turtle. Now, here's what the story says. This, and I found a bunch of different articles on this one. This is from thedailydose.com, which is a conservative internet news source, which is slow to come up on my screen. Here we go. The federal government would have us believe that this overwhelming shock and awe type force being used against a Nevada rancher is to benefit a tortoise. It is likely that once again, just as in the case of the Delta smelt in California, the wildlife is being used as the key to control people. In this instance, the supposed pressure to force Mr. Bundy off his land came from environmentalists. The feds already occupy roughly 85% of Nevada, and they restrict access to that land as they choose. The armed forces are out, wasting millions of taxpayers' dollars to run this rancher off of his land. After they've dealt with Mr. Bundy, now they editorialize a bit, these jackboots will move on to another citizen or another group of citizens and then to larger groups, establishing precedents along the way. This isn't just the fight of one man against anonymous bureaucrats. It's a fight we all have a stake in.
So I looked the story up, and the part that I'm not clear on is I saw several articles that seem to indicate that he had his cattle on public land, but he's disputing that. He's saying it was his land. I guess Nevada's saying it's public land. He had a license to graze cattle on that land and wasn't paying the licensing fee. So after several years of not paying the fee, they said, no, we're revoking your license. He kept the cattle there. They start removing the cattle now for the trespassing.
And that chain of events is typical in situations like this. Oftentimes, in where the government has co-opted land going back century, right, and then said, but we're going to allow you to keep using it, and here's the process. And then the process goes from, an agreement to a licensing process to a licensing process with a fee to then paying, and, you get down to the other end of the road and you find out that the promise that was made in 1865 to your great-great-great-grandfather is now being broken by bureaucrats in today's federal government. And you're so far removed from the beginning of that situation that people like us who don't have a real connection to it end up confused as to what's really going on. I mean, ask the Indians how well our federal government keeps its treaties.
And there are probably several separate issues there. One being who actually owns the land. But if it is public land, I mean, there's a reasonable. If I bought a cow and took it down to Elmwood Park and put it there, I don't think I could really complain if somebody moved my cow because it's not my property. I did find it a little troubling in the story, the son being arrested because his son was arrested protesting.
Yes.
And that certainly is troubling.
Because he didn't protest in the designated First Amendment area. They marked off a little square with some plastic fencing and said, this is your. In here you have constitutional rights. Out here you don't. And that is...
Certainly, I'm not sure that situation, even if he is protesting along the road or whatever he was doing, I'm not sure that should have escalated to snipers, if there are, in fact.
And that situation, that escalation you talk about is common In fact, it's becoming even more common as we militarize our local police forces. There's a case up in Fredericksburg where a young man who it's right outside of Fredericksburg, and what happened was a guy that used to work for him got angry because he had been fired. So he showed up at the house trying to break into the boss's house and found the boss home and took off. Now, after he left, he called the police, and he told the police that the boss had shot at him. So they showed up with 18 cruisers and a SWAT team, broke into the house. Now, they don't have a warrant. At the time, and the surveillance videos show this, they do not have a warrant yet to go into the house, but agents are already inside the house trying to track him down. He's holed up in a bedroom, in fear of his life, having done nothing but been the victim of an attempted break-in by a disgruntled ex-employee. But they didn't bother finding any of all that out. They just took, this guy says I was shot at, and then 50 policemen, with militarized weapons and show up. And they even subpoenaed in this trial. They subpoenaed the recordings of the agents talking to each other. And these guys are talking about popping this guy, and they're going to take him down. And, and he's done nothing. The whole thing was based on a lie.
I think I'm reading a book now about the increasing militarization of the police force, and I think the increase in SWAT raids and just this overwhelming police presence is troubling. Not that it isn't sometimes necessary, but I'm not sure that we need that kind of show of force
for something like that.
Right.
And if they
or to serve warrants on nonviolent offenses.
They could have just knocked on the door, sent a single officer out just to find out what was going on, knocked on the door and found out, oh, so that's what it is. Well, we need to get a statement from you.
If they're hearing their shots fired, they're probably not going to just walk up and knock on the door and say, hey, what's going on? But
they have no corroboration of shots being, because shots weren't fired. They have no corroboration of that. All they have is the testimony of the one disgruntled employee who was trying to break in the guy's house.
So then can you be annoyed with someone and call up and say, they were shooting at me, and have their house surrounded by SWAT? That's...
Evidently, yes.
Less than ideal,
In the case of the rancher, going back to land use and public land versus private land, think about, in the context of everyone who has been hoodooed into turning over their family's private land into land conservatories. And we even have this kind of thing in Virginia where people can skirt paying property taxes. And what they do is they make the property taxes so exorbitant that to avoid having an enormous bill to keep your own property, what may have been your family's property since 100 years ago, they'll offer you the idea to put it tax-free into a conservatory situation with the state. Telling you, but it's still yours,
sure,
and you can still use it. This just means that it's going to be protected by the state, and we won't charge you the enormous taxes on your own property that we have. And then these people find out, once this has been done, that they actually don't have control over the property, and actually it's really technically not theirs anymore.
Read the fine print.
Oh yeah, and the fine print is evidently 6 inches thick in the agreements that you have with these things. And so it is, I would read the fine print, even if it took me a year to go through 6 inches. However, is it really right for our government to play these kind of games with people so that they can get their hands on individuals' property? Is that really, should I have to be put in a situation because of unfair taxation that I have to give up my own property and I have to read 6 inches worth of documents to make sure I'm being treated fairly to hold on to what really belongs to me?
Should you have to bear the weight of unfair taxation? No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't have to consider these things to avoid taxes. However, if you do consider them and you do sign it over, you have to, I think, take some responsibility for
Yep.
for having done so.
And Bonita, Ms. Bonita, who fought the land, the farm use thing, that's the situation she was in. She found out after she did this, it wasn't quite like they had said. Now, in her case, they were actually doing some things that technically, according to the agreement, it doesn't say. But see, once you sign these things, what's there doesn't matter. It's what a judge decides after the fact. So even if you look through the documents and everything about this agreement you're making with the government about the land is okay and to your liking, then the government just does whatever they want after the fact. And if they can get a judge to say, yep, we're going to let them do it, it doesn't matter what's written on those pieces of paper. It's not going, and you have no recourse but to protest in the First Amendment area. And at what point does someone have the right to use whatever means necessary to protect themselves and their property?
Well, I guess since we still have the open question of whose property is it, I guess we can...
These things become very convoluted because of the
part for me that's not convoluted, though, is that certainly they should be able to protest it, free from interference.
Absolutely. And
threat. They should be able to protest it and have the discussion and raise awareness about it.
So, how have you, I guess, viewed them turning Washington, D.C. into a no First Amendment area, basically? Is that, and not just a tiny little area of it. Basically, the District of Columbia can regulate speech in any way they want, evidently, and nobody is stopping them.
There can't be zones.
This is so insane you don't even know what to say.
I mean, unless it's private property, on my property, I can say you can't say these things or just get off my property. But in a city, in public property, you can't say nah, we're not good with the First Amendment. I don't think that works.
Well,
I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure
they've been doing it in D.C. with the Second Amendment since before we were born, probably. Now that's eroding. Interestingly enough, as Second Amendment rights are starting to see their day in Washington D.C., First Amendment rights are waning. It's very odd.
There have been some court challenges, which in both D.C. and Chicago for the Second Amendment cases, which is good. Yeah.
Well, and the Second Amendment won in Illinois, and in fact, just recently, January, the state of Illinois finally set up a process to license concealed carry permit holders in the state of Illinois. And you know what they discovered happened after measuring the crime statistics in Chicago from the first quarter of 2014?
What we knew would happen.
Yes. Right. Crime went down in some cases by a factor of 40% in just the first quarter of licensing concealed weapon permit.
It just still remains mind-boggling that was ever an issue, that an entire city could say, nah, not here.
New York does it. And in the famous case of Bernard Goetz, I mean, what happens when just one sole person decides, you know what, there's right and there's wrong, and I'm just going to stand up and fight? What happened until they figured out who the subway vigilante was? Crime on the subways went to zero. The perps were afraid to pop somebody on the subway because they didn't know what the person looked like, who they were, whether they were a male, whether they were a female, whether they were a teenager. It just came to a dead halt because
somebody might shoot back.
Because the criminals were afraid of somebody defending themselves. And as soon as they got Bernard Goetz and made a demon out of him in the press in New York, then crime went right back to normal on the subways of New York. So the lesson here in that case is that individual rights and freedom seem to be the thing that makes everything work better. We're safer, more prosperous. The exercise of liberty is not a bad thing.
And I think there's also a lesson in that states can't take away those freedoms any more than the federal government should be able to take away those freedoms.
True. Well, or local government. or other people. Now, we've been in decade after decade of an erosion of those rights at every level, from local governments telling you how tall your grass is allowed to be, to what color you're allowed to paint the siding on your house, to the federal government saying, "Let's drop." Oh, the music's playing. You can't hear it because you're not wearing headphones, but that means we have to come back in just a minute. You're listening to News Guardians. If you'd like to read the stories we're talking about, go to newsguardians.com and check out the picture of car tipping. It's hysterical. No, we're not kidding. This brought to you by Bent Mountain Bistro. Everything's better on the mountain. Take a trip up the mountain. It's just 15 minutes from 419 right there at Brambleton. Drive down Brambleton, go up the mountain. It'll be on the right just across from the fire station, and enjoy some brick oven pizza or even a wood-fired ribeye steak. And the barbecue is slow smoked in their own smokehouse right out back. We'll be right back on Vox Radio 910.
This is News Guardian. News Guardian with Greg Aldridge and Chip Tarbutton on WFJX Fox Radio 910.
Welcome back to News Guardians on Fox Radio 910, and we are again here with Melissa Scott, who is, are you the chairman or what's your official title in the local Libertarian Party?
I'm the chair of Roanoke Valley Libertarians, which is the affiliate committee for Roanoke County, Franklin County, and the surrounding areas, and I'm also the chair of the 5th District on the State Central Committee of the Libertarian Party of Virginia.
Now, 5th District. Okay, so that you're down south of
I'm
town.
in Franklin County, right?
Gotcha, okay. Just real quick before we go into the story of the EPA redrawing state lines, tell us a little bit about what your group does, what they believe, what you're working on.
Our group, specifically our group, or the Libertarian Party? So the Libertarian Party advocates reducing drastically the size and scope of government. We think there is a tremendous amount of government overreach. The local affiliates are just the on-the-ground groups of the Libertarian Party. So we have meetings, we have debate meetings like we're having tonight. We have speakers. We do petitioning and campaigning for our candidates, those sorts of things.
And you do community outreach. I've seen you at I've seen you at the gun shows.
We love outreach. That's the thing that I like the most is doing outreach at gun shows and festivals and just getting out and talking to people about what it means to be a libertarian, because I think that's sort of the long game. That libertarianism doesn't lend itself, I think, to sound bites, to snappy little things that you can post on Facebook. I think in the long run, we're going to have to change the way people look at the role of government, the appropriate role of government, the appropriate scope. And that's not an easy thing that we can do with sound bites. So I think that's the real work, is just being out and talking to people about what it means.
So if you happen to have seen Melissa or one of the other members of the local libertarian group at the gun show, they have what they call the world's smallest political quiz. And what have you learned about the general political beliefs of people from administering that quiz at gun shows all these years?
That has been the really interesting thing. I thought that when I started doing this, I would have thought that I could read a group and say, okay, when we go to the gun show, the people taking this quiz are going to be conservatives. And when we do Pride in the Park, those people are going to be liberals. And it doesn't really work that way. A lot of times people are sort of above the center, and when they take the quiz, they score in the libertarian quadrant, which is interesting to me. It's also interesting. I'm a data analyst, and so I get a little geeky about this, and I'll sometimes take the quizzes from an event and kind of go through them and see what question people don't score libertarian on, and that's kind of interesting too.
Now, I find, because I look at the board every time I go to the gun show, and I've noticed the same thing. Regardless of where you are, once they've answered the questions, which are really just questioning some core beliefs on how you think you and your government should be interacting and what authority it should have, they all tend to fall libertarian more so than anything else, which is consistent with the idea that human beings human beings have ingrained in their DNA the desire and the belief in freedom. We just don't know how to materialize that in dealing with our daily lives. And I think oftentimes we don't know how to apply that to decisions that are being made. It doesn't mean that people don't have a firmly rooted belief in freedom. They've been miseducated on how to exercise that freedom over the last 50, 60 years, probably.
I think the left-right idea is so entrenched that people don't think about it anymore. They think I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and because I'm a Republican or a Democrat, this is what I think. And they stop thinking about it instead of left-right. They stop thinking about it as more government or less government. They're looking at it as left-right. So when you take that away, when you're just asking the question, should the government do this? Should the government do this? Then you see that they really, if you take away left-right, they really are scoring more libertarian because they really do believe the government shouldn't be involved in all of the things that we currently have the government in.
Well, and oftentimes people's answer to that question in practice is, yes, the government should if they're doing it to somebody else. But as soon as they're doing it to me, then the answer becomes no. There's a double. People tend to, and it's the human thing, tend to apply a double standard.
Absolutely.
To what they're willing to accept from government, and
I think that's where we need to be. People need to be not just willing, but want to defend freedom when it doesn't affect them, when it affects somebody else, and it's a choice that you wouldn't make. But the point is that we have to defend the freedom of people to make that choice, because what if next time it is you, it is something that affects you? You would want us all to be working together to say, no, that's not okay.
I get into heated arguments with people oftentimes over what property rights are, and oftentimes people, and this is largely comes from people who live in urban areas or even in suburban areas, where their idea of property rights is not only do I have a right to my property, but I also have a right not to have to see, hear, or know about anything I don't like happening on somebody else's property. And so they put up with government giving them codes on how tall the grass is going to be, what type of roofing material you've used, whether or not you can put a tree house in your backyard, how close the driveway can be to the property line, and all of these things. When just like we said, when it's them, they want the freedom to do it. But when it's their neighbor doing it, they want to tell them whether or not they can have an emu. They want to tell them whether or not they can build a garage if the garage is going to be 12 inches from the property line. And I had to leave town for that. That is one of the reasons why I had to move out of Roanoke, out to where I live. And I discovered that you move away from that.
You don't get away from it.
You don't. I got away from the government regulation, but you don't get away from other people exercising their rights. I have a neighbor that's got chickens, and those roosters oftentimes are so loud. And I have pretty good sized land, and they're pretty far away, but you can still hear them. Mm-hmm. And I've been woken up when I didn't want to wake up. I have tried to sit on my porch sometimes and quietly drink coffee and watch the sun come up, and had the cacophony of roosters, driving me batty sometimes. And if I had the mentality that seems to permeate what's normal in our society, I would be calling the Board of Supervisors asking for a law to tell them that they can't, that they got to do something to stop them from the noise, or they're not allowed to have the chickens because it's violating my rights, which would be completely wrong and unfair of me to try to impose on my neighbor.
I did the same thing. I moved. I lived in Roanoke, and I moved to Franklin County. I wanted more room and away from homeowners associations and all of the regulations, and I found the same thing. So in my neighborhood, I have much more room, but I had neighbors when I first moved there. Their kids rode dirt bikes, and it's loud, and it would wake me up every weekend first thing, and his friends would come, and it's like the X Games across from my house, and so, in general, I think we should embrace people exercising their freedom. I was struggling there to embrace the freedom to do that, but you're right, the answer is not asking for a noise pollution regulation. I don't think. No, I think the answer is just sort of working with your neighbors and having a community.
While it may be annoying, the sound of those motorcycles or the sound of those roosters, that's the sound of freedom.
Exactly.
And that's the first few times it started going on, it was a little annoying, and then all of a sudden I realized how beautiful a sound that was. It may be interrupting my peaceful coffee drinking sunrise morning. However, the fact that noise exists and is there is why I got to build a tree house without having to get a permit. It's why I get to go out into my woods and cut the dead trees down and turn them into firewood. It's why I get to build trails to ride a mountain bike on my property without having to worry about having to go to the government and ask permission, get a permit, pay a fee, or any of those things.
I think you make a good point. I am very grateful to be where I am and have the freedom that I do there on my property. So I should keep in perspective the dog license thing. But I'm struggling to, I'll be honest.
The dog license thing, and we can talk about that when we come back, that's not the sound of freedom. That is not
being able to get away from the reach of the government.
No, it sure isn't. We have Melissa Scott from the Roanoke Libertarian Group here with us this morning, and thanks for coming. We got one more segment, so we'll be back with Melissa on News Guardians right after this.
News Guardians on Fox Radio 910.
We are back with the News Guardians and our special guest host this morning, Melissa Scott. Good morning, Melissa.
Good morning.
Now, it's the last segment, and as usual...
I talked too much.
No, this is... it doesn't matter what you do. This is the fastest hour of local radio there is. And oftentimes we get all prepared at the beginning to make sure we have plenty of material to talk to people about, and what we find out is the hour goes by in just a few seconds, and only a part of what we ever wanted to talk about do we get to. It's just the way it works. But you brought a story in talking about the value of protest movements and protests themselves. Now, what did you find interesting about this?
Well, we were talking about, I don't remember why we were talking about protests yesterday, but it made me think of this article I just read in The Atlantic about the value of protests. And I don't agree with everything in the article, but it is an interesting question. And there were a couple of interesting points in the article. One is, do street protests ultimately lead to substantive political change? And two, it mentioned sort of clicktivism. You know, people on Facebook now, it's very easy now to organize a big protest because you have social media, but you aren't... It sort of skips the step that you needed before social media of organizing on the ground. And there was some value to that organization after the protest. You needed that to really affect the change going forward. But now we have social media and you can organize these big protests without putting that in place. But you also have people who, okay, well, I shared this snarky thing or this sarcastic little thing on Facebook there. I'm participating in the political process. And I think you lose some of the actual effort that needs to go into change.
Well,
but with that said, I love a good protest, and I love protests. I actually do think that there is value in protests.
Well, the Tea Party movement of the last half decade in Roanoke started with a few people who posted something on Facebook. And it wasn't totally put together by social media, but it was the catalyst to it. And then local radio picked it up and talked about, hey, there's these people that are going to do this thing. And before you know it, there were hundreds of people amassed down by the river in what where the soccer fields are at the other end of Wasena Park, having the very first Roanoke Tea Party, essentially. But it was a social media post by a few people in the very beginning to say, hey, we're going to do this thing, that actually got that started. Now, the question here is, does it really affect substantive change? And I would submit that it does often cause changes to happen. It's just a question as to whether or not they're the right change or good or bad, or even the change that the people participating thought was going to happen.
And certainly it may not affect the change that they intended.
Absolutely. Now, I went to 2 protests in Washington, D.C. that were organized as Tea Party protests, and saw in one of those cases well over 1 million people. And another one of those cases, I would say 400,000 to 500,000 people there. And of course, you would read the news stories or watch the television, and they would talk about tens of thousands. Okay, yeah. There were hundreds of tens of thousands. So tens of thousands might be a correct assessment of it if you applied some extra numbers to that. But what I was trying to do in going to those things was to stop what was being done, was to stop the march of further and further government control over everything. And with that as a goal, I think we absolutely failed. I don't think it had any effect whatsoever in stopping the overreach of an unconstitutional activity of our government.
I think what you see, though, is, and maybe it's not something that you can measure. Maybe you can't say, we had this protest and it resulted in this law being changed or whatever. But I think you do have people, so even, and there are always, these things about who actually organized the protest and got them started, but regardless of how it happened, you have people who come out, who see it and say, you know what, I agree with that. I've had enough. I'm going to go out and say I've had enough. And I think there's value in that in itself, because people get out there and they talk to other people who are there and they get information, and I think that moves the discourse along. So I went actually in D.C. I went up one weekend, I was in D.C. and went to Occupy. And you would think you would think I wouldn't be a good fit there. I just wanted to check it out. And I got there, and I had some really interesting conversations with the people there. I found things that I agreed with these people on in having, interesting, thoughtful conversations. And I think there's value in that.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Occupy, because when the Occupy movement started springing up and we had our own group here in Roanoke, I went the first day they were out there to try to talk to them, and got on Facebook and was trying to communicate with them, because I was just fascinated because a lot of what they were complaining about are the same things we were complaining about.
Right.
Where I found the breakdown in trying to work with them was in what they thought the solution was. And but
I think it's dangerous to sort of assign that to the entire group. Because, again, I thought the same thing, but I got down there, and when I talked to people, we found things that we agreed on.
Well, and I found things I agreed with them on. We agreed that the Federal Reserve was a criminal organization. We agreed that corporations have been afforded way too much power because of their collusion with bankers and so then I would say, well then, let's fix that. Let's get governments to stop passing laws to empower them, and let's strip the power that they're able to use in government to do that. And they said, no, we need more government. We need government to have more regulations on it and more power. I'm like, that's not going to fix the problem. That is just further exasperating the problem. And the problem wasn't agreeing on some of the problems. The problem came in what they thought the solutions should be, and we couldn't find any agreement on that end of it. And
I think in those sort of long-term protesting things, like what happened with Occupy and the Tea Party and in Egypt and things like that, is when you have these long-term protests, you have organized groups coming in to try to guide those protests in a certain way. And once that happens, then it's no longer this organic, hey, we've had enough thing, then it becomes a different thing.
Well, and then that happened with the Tea Party movement, because establishment factions within the Republican Party...
You said it, I didn't.
No, it did. Establishment factions within the Republican Party looked at this and went, wow, there's incredible power there. How can we infiltrate it, co-opt it, and use it to our gain? And in many cases, that's exactly what they did. Now, I have to say that in defense of the Roanoke Tea Party, they're the antithesis of that.
I think what happens when that happens is you see the people... So some people are going to agree with that. So the Republicans are going to come into the Tea Party, and there are a lot of people in the Tea Party who are going to agree with that. And I think what happens is the people who aren't Republicans are going to leave. And I think that's what happened with the Tea Party movement. The Republicans came in, the people who agreed stayed, the people who didn't left. So now you're left with...
Well, what mostly happened within at least the Roanoke Tea Party, the Salem Tea Party, the groups around here, because we were adamantly against being controlled by local Republicans or state Republicans. I mean, we've worked with them on things, but often they were telling us, we want you to do this and we want you to promote this thing. We said no. So what happened is the people who were the diehard Republicans in the bunch, those are the ones that left. Mostly what we're left with are in the local Tea Parties are members who are still Republican leaning and weren't so turned off by our message of, we're not just going to do things because the Republican leadership is telling us to. That's just not going to happen. The people who agreed with that are the ones that bugged out. Now, that's not the way the Tea Party movement as a whole. There are Tea Parties just in our state that were created by Republican leadership so that they could have something called a Tea Party to use to promote whatever their local Republican group was doing. There's a national Tea Party that did the exact same thing. That it basically is just a Tea Party name fronting for the Republican establishment. But it's not the whole of what is Tea Party. It's just inherent in any kind of movement or any type of group. Just like you said, people come in and they try to mess with it. Maybe on our next Wednesday visit, we can delve into some
next Libertarian Wednesday.
We can delve into some of the specifics.
Created a radio monster
of that. I mean, there are Republicans angry, absolutely angry, and to the point of near violence with me and other leadership in the group because we won't just go along with their Republican Party thing. I mean, I wasn't kidding the other day on the Facebook page when I said, look, the Libertarian group don't have anything to do with me because I'm such a problem, and I'm blamed for being a Republican. Now, the Republican Party doesn't want anything to do with me either. I have no political home. I'm homeless, except right here on the News Guardians. This is the only political home I have, and I am so glad that you
Thanks
visited
for inviting me into your home.
Next time we'll make tea.
It has to have a lot of caffeine in it in the morning.
If you'd like to read the stories we've been talking about this morning, you can go to newsguardians.com. I will not be here tomorrow. I'm going to be on assignment, but Chip will be here with Mike Powell, and then Chip and I will be here Friday to wrap up the week, both of us together, and then we'll have Melissa back again second Wednesday of May.
Yes.
Second Wednesday of May. And don't forget, if you'd like to go discuss their topic tonight and meet with some of the people in their group, 7 o'clock, Corned Beef and Company in downtown Roanoke.
Please join us.
Thanks, Melissa.